Hello, everyone. So today we are going to be continuing our discussion about the Reform era, but we are going to be focusing on a few different groups today. We're going to focus on workers, slaves, women, and immigrants. Obviously, some people overlap there. However, we are going to focus on these groups of people. So let's get to it. From the beginning to the middle of the 1800s, you had more and more Americans. They were working in mills and factories. A factory, by definition, that's just a building or like a set of buildings where something is manufactured, either by hand, by machine, a mixture. So let's talk about some of the conditions in some of these early factories and mills. First of all, you would have very long hours. Typically, people would work 12 to 14, sometimes 16 hours a day. And if they had a lunch break, it would typically be about a half an hour. And while workers typically labored 6 days a week, with Sunday was observed as a day of rest, the work continued all year long. And even if there was bad weather, they still had to do the work. It was inside. So there were really bad conditions inside and things were dangerous. Some of these early some of this early machinery was it was inherently dangerous. You could lose a limb easily. And so also in wintertime, whenever the natural light died early, factories would typically be lit with this whale oil type of lamp. And the machinery also ran on steam, and it was produced by wood or coal fires. And so you would have a lot of dry air, and it would cause threads to break more easily. And so you also had windows that were sealed shut. And so you had the environment was kept really humid. And so this made the air quality very poor. And so it was fairly common for fires to break out. There were very poor wages also during this time. And something that was very common was they liked to hire children because they were physically much smaller than adults, so they could fit into a confined space. Their small hands could work that machinery, and so they also paid them less than adults. So the labor was cheaper, even cheaper than, not paying people very much money. And so you had child labor persisting until basically the Great Depression. And so with the growth of these factories and mills, you had a lot of different problems in urban areas. A lot of people would move there and the infrastructure couldn't keep up. Fire codes weren't really a thing. There were sanitation issues. There was crime. It was just very difficult living in these big cities. Lowell mills, these were textile mills, and this is known as some of the earliest under one roof mill. So they were known for having a really strict control of their workers. And they mostly hired young women. So they would basically go to homes nearby and recruit women aged 15 to 30. They would try to get them younger, and they would live in boarding houses near the factory where they controlled their lives, what they ate, when they slept, everything that they'd done. And oftentimes they would work around the clock at these mills, and they would work upwards of 80 hours a week, 5 days a week, half day on Saturday. Sunday, you would observe the Sabbath and go to church. There started at this point to be organized strikes. And so this is whenever you see the beginning of labor movements. Okay, so we're going to move on to slavery in the era of reform. So with the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney and the growth of the Industrial Revolution, the focus on slavery grew. in the South, they were trying to keep up with the need for those raw materials. And so slavery, the amount of people that were enslaved exploded at this time. And with this growth in slavery, you had the abolitionist movement also grows. And again, the abolitionist movement is, remember, they're trying to abolish or get rid of slavery. So you have different abolitionists, very vocal abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison. We'll take a look at him in a second, and Frederick Douglass. So they're very different people. They come from different backgrounds. They have different views. But they start attacking slavery in print. You have William Lloyd Garrison writes The Liberator, and Douglass writes the North Star. And these are known as very influential abolitionist newspapers. So on the left, you have William Lloyd Garrison, and you have sort of his protege being Frederick Douglass. So Frederick Douglass was a leading spokesperson for the rest of his life for the abolition of slavery and racial equality. His real name wasn't Frederick Douglass. He was Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. So he was a son of a slave woman and an unknown white man. The only thing that he knew about his father is that he was white. And so he was born in Maryland. He only saw his mother like 4 or 5 times before she died whenever he was really young. And so whenever he was young, he saw how brutal slavery was, witnessing whippings, and he spent a lot of his time very hungry. And he eventually, after his mom died, he was sent to live in Baltimore. And there he learned to read, and he read different writings about abolition. But later on, he was sent back to work in a more rural area on a farm. He was whipped every day, barely fed. And he called this a time whenever he was broken in body, soul, and spirit. So he tried to escape. He was jailed. He finally escaped later, met his wife, married her, and then he settled under his new name, Frederick Douglass. So he wanted to stay educated, keep learning, keep reading. He joined a church, went to meetings of abolitionists, and this is where he met William Lloyd Garrison. Both were very impressed by each other. So later on, Frederick Douglass he saw Garrison as a mentor. And they got along really well. Garrison pushed Frederick Douglass to make speeches and to, help out in the abolitionist movement. And so things were really great between the two of them until their beliefs changed. So Garrison actually was more of a radical abolitionist. He denounced public parties, different churches, and even voting. He thought that there should be a dissolution in the Union. He thought that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document in comparison to Frederick Douglass. He took more of a pragmatic approach. Like he wanted to problem solve. He didn't see the Constitution as a pro-slavery document. He didn't think that the Union should dissolve. And he felt that way because he didn't want, if it dissolved, for slaves to be so isolated in the South that they would still be treated poorly. And so it led to a pretty bitter dispute. And they both, until the end of their lives, took a very active role in bettering the lives of African Americans. So these two are extremely important in that push of the abolitionist movement. You have a calling for the emancipation of slaves. That would be the process of being set free from those legal, social, political restrictions. It's a liberation. Some call for a gradual release of slaves. This picture breaks my heart every time I look at it. But some call for a gradual release of slaves because they think that it would cripple the South's economy, among other reasons. They think it'd be easier to adjust, and there are many reasons. Others call for the immediate emancipation of slavery. And so he based these arguments on religious reasons, things from the Bible, values that are put forward in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Um, we hold these truths to be self evident that all men are created equal. Is that true whenever there are slaves? No. So people use these as well as different key tenets within the Bible to argue for the emancipation of slaves. At this point, you see a major slave rebellion come forward in the 1830s. So you had Nathaniel or Nat Turner. He was a slave who led this rebellion. Nat Turner's father, from an early age, had let him learn to read, write, understand religion. He believed that he was chosen to lead enslaved African Americans from bondage. He saw visions, he heard voices telling him that he was the chosen one. He and 6 other slaves killed the Travis family. They got horses, they got arms, and they got about 80 other slaves to come with them. And they got together this insurrection. And in the end, around 50 people were killed. Whenever everything was said and done, you have 56 African Americans who are executed, and more than 200 others were beaten by angry mobs or white militias. So he hid in the woods until October. And so he was found and he was captured, tried, and hanged. Afterwards, his body was flayed, beheaded, and it was meant to show that he was an example. He was supposed to be an example what could happen to other people if they did the same thing. The main thing you really need to know is that it put fear in the heart of Southern society. It resulted in even harsher laws against slaves, more strict control, and it deepened this and it led to more strict control of slaves. So there was actually a large number of people actually, who defended slavery. They saw it as a core piece of their economy in the South. And for the longest, people had been saying that it was a necessary evil. It was something that they were not necessarily, and there were some that would call it a necessary evil, not necessarily loving the idea, but that it was necessary for their economy. That transitioned into what was called a positive good. And a lot of these people who defended slavery did not like that the North had something to say about that institution of slavery. And then some of the people who also defend slavery believe that slaves had better lives than Northern workers because of working conditions inside the factories, that strict control, and just sometimes having to live in squalor. Okay, so let's talk about women in the era of reform. There was this idea of the cult of domesticity. Time in which we're talking about, this was from 1820 to around 1860. And this is the rise of an idea in America of feminine behavior and an ideal of what womanliness is. And it essentially says that the role of women should traditionally be in the home. And it provided social regulations for these middle class families with newly acquired wealth and leisure. So women did not have voting rights. Women did not have property rights, especially if they were married. Everything was delegated to the husband. Women actually play a key role in 3 movements, especially well-to-do women who have money and who have time, the ones who are not, working in the fields, working in factories. So they played a key role in abolition movements, obviously to abolish slavery, get rid of slavery. The temperance movement, that movement to ban alcohol, which we will talk about again, because they felt that it disrupted the moral fiber of a family. And the suffrage movement. Obviously, women would have to do with the suffrage movement at this point. That movement to gain the right to vote, because women were disenfranchised for quite some time. And then things take a major change at Seneca Falls. This was the first women's rights. Oh, that says right. I'm sorry. It's supposed to say rights. This was the first women's rights convention, and this was in Seneca Falls, New York. This was July 19th and 20th in 1848. So it was 2 days and 2 evenings at candlelight. About 300 people met. So their declaration, and I'm going to actually read the major part of this, and it's going to sound very familiar. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That should sound extremely familiar. For these women's rights advocates, they patterned their document directly on the Declaration of Independence. They demand for the woman's right to vote. They asserted that women should have equality in every area of life: politics, education, jobs, religion, the family, morals. And so the idea is that the United States had been disenfranchising, or not giving someone the right to vote, half of the people in the country. And so Seneca Falls initiated the organized women's rights movement, and it tied women's rights to the country's natural rights tradition. So this is you have some leading figures here. The Grimke sisters, we'll talk about them. Susan B. Anthony, you should know that name if no one else. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and Sojourner Truth. We will talk about her later on. Several reformers, and these are some of the first people to mention this in the United States in a very serious capacity at a convention. Several reformers suggested that women were equal in intellect and abilities to men. This movement made a lot of people feel uncomfortable. And so in the end, this was where women do begin the quest for equal rights. Okay, let's talk about immigrants. So from the 30s to the 60s, you see a large influx of immigrants. Approximately 4 million people came to the United States. Just from the 30s to the 50s, it was about 4 million. So you can tack on more for that last decade. It slows down in the 60s, Civil War. But anyways, about 4 million people from the 30s to the 50s, they come to the United States for a better life. They come by ship to larger cities like Boston, Philadelphia, New York. A lot of them remained where they landed, and so that's where you start to see major growth in cities. But some moved to rural areas. Not many went to the South, where immigration labor could not compete with slavery. So why come here? First of all, most immigrants were Irish and German. First of all, it was more inexpensive and quick to come over with improvements in ocean transportation. Second of all, famines and revolutions in Europe were going on. And 3, the United States had a growing reputation for economic opportunities and political freedom. So the Irish are coming over. You probably already know this, but the Irish, about half of the immigrants during this time come over from Ireland, and a lot of them were driven here by the potato famine. They arrived to discrimination because of their Catholicism, and eventually after decades, they were accepted in these major cities, but they came to a lot of discrimination. Germans came over for different reasons. There were a lot of growing economic hardships in Germany at the time, and a lot of that had to do with failed revolutions in 1848. And so the difference between the Germans, a lot of those immigrants had modest means and some skills to bring with them. The Irish struggled with that. A lot of them were farmers. So keep that in mind. At this point, You have a growing nativist sentiment. These were basically native born Americans who did not like immigrants. They thought immigrants would take their jobs and weaken the culture of the Anglo Saxon white majority. And there were a lot of just basically Protestants who distrusted Catholics. So you also have this growing of the Know Nothing Party. They got this Know Nothing name because whenever members were asked about activities, like what they were doing, they're supposed to reply, I know nothing. So they became known as the Know Nothing Party. So they were a semi secret organization, and it was only open to Protestant males, and they were anti Irish. So we will talk more about the Know Nothings and nativism. This is just a chart showing the growth of Irish immigrants. You see 1830, it's pretty low, and then it shoots way up, and then whoop, 1860, it goes down again. All right, so that is it for today. I hope you all have a great rest of your day.